I'd like to welcome everybody to RC demonstration number 5. I haven't done too much of these, and I think that's going to change this calendar year. Well, I mean, we're already more than a third of the way through the calendar year, but yeah, I haven't really updated the channel that much so far. But yeah, this is number 5. So today's demonstration is going to be about Cameron's fancy subject pictures. This is from PT 73, section 1, questions 8 through 15. So it is the second RC passage of section 1 in Prep Test 73. So let's get started here. As always, I start with what makes this passage relatively unfun and therefore worthy of demonstration. And this one actually is a request from one of your fellow viewers. Specifically, they wanted to know how the structural reading that I've put up on this channel can be used to help answer questions that demand knowledge of details. Details that I often tell you guys to skip over or just kind of paper over on your first initial read through. So that's a valid question. The short answer is you have to go back and reread for such detail-oriented responses. Structural reading helps you find the right location faster without relying purely on Control F, which has its own pitfalls, like you have to know the search term and you have to make sure that you check everything a couple lines above and below and all that sort of stuff. And structural reading also helps you contextualize the detail properly when you do find it. So not only do you know where the detail is, you know why it's there. You know who it helps, how it helps them, that sort of thing, especially since a lot of these things are somewhat argumentative and somewhat debate structured. But really, those things are kind of similar to, I would say, the amount of research demanded by Cameron's fancy subject picture passage is not actually that out of line with other passages. What I think, personally, makes this one unfun is that it's just another one about an obscure artist and yet another passage full of reasons just not to care. They're obscure for a reason. On top of the obscurity, which already kind of adds a certain density and boredom to it, there's an element of this body of work superficially does X, but also actually does Y. So the whole duality thing, which of course you have probably come across if you've done any significant volume of RC practice, the duality also does add a certain complexity to it. It makes it feel at least a little bit less straightforward. So this might also just be my personal preference here, but the final reason why I didn't like it was the writing feels a bit too elaborate for academic purposes. It's nothing a properly educated undergrad can't handle, but in the pressure of doing RC under time constraints, it can burn precious processing power. I didn't realize I just did an alliteration there, but yeah, it does eat up processing power. Just to make sure, like, you have to do double takes sometimes, but like, wait a minute, did I read that correctly? And as much as I tell you not to reread things, sometimes it's instinctive, right? So it happens. So without further ado, let's actually get into the content itself. So as we always do, I will be mapping the passage paragraph by paragraph, trying to predict where it's going. So starting with paragraph 1, so the actual reading phase. Now, starting with the first sentence, this is pretty dense and long for a leading sentence. I guess based on this, it's going to be all about a photographer named Cameron. Of course, we heard about that in the little italicized 2-sentence intro to the passage that was above the passage proper. And what she herself, Cameron herself, calls fancy subject pictures. And we get a definition for that in hyphens. I'm not going to replicate it here. You guys can read it for yourselves. But we do get a definition for what a fancy subject picture actually is. Our author, not Cameron, the author of our passage, says that these photos often betray the comical conditions under which they were taken. I think it's important to note here that we're not really sure if Cameron was aware of this aspect or acknowledged this aspect of her work. I just think it's important to note that this is something specifically that our author has said and is not attributing that comment to Cameron. So knowing who says what and why is, of course, attributions are extremely important. Skipping down to the last sentence. While I struggle to see exactly what the author is driving at with this one, I at least discern that the author thinks that these fancy subject pictures are not a successful execution of Cameron's goal of making seamless works of illustrative art, whatever that is. And also the fancy subject pictures are not among the curiosities of Victorian photography, as I would presume that's Rylander's works were. As for why any of that really matters, I have no clue. They do wrap up that sentence at the end saying that they're like treasures and they're awesome, fancy subject pictures, that is, but I don't really have anything more specific beyond that. I don't really know why they're so awesome. Now that we've actually read the two things that I read in a passage, or paragraph, excuse me, let's move on to the mapping part of it. So, in terms of trying to predict what I skipped, probably more details about the kind of stuff that we actually see in these fancy subject pictures. Because I'm getting sick of typing it out, here and after I'm going to abbreviate that to FSP. And for those of you who are unaware, here and after or henceforth and term followed by term, this sort of parenthetical comment is very common in legal documentation. So yeah, something that you might want to just get used to. As for where this is going, I really have no clue, as indicated by my inability to grasp exactly why the last sentence matters, despite knowing what it says. So I do know that the author thinks ultimately, at least is making some complimentary comments about Cameron's work, but I'm not really sure why or where that's going, other than the fact that they just, I guess they like it. Turning along to paragraph 2 here. The first sentence. Apparently our author thinks that the camera's realism, which we again get a definition for, much like we got one for what an FSP is last time. That realism is what gives Cameron's theatricality and artificiality, and I see these as being presented in contrast to realism. The realism is what gives Cameron's work an atmosphere of truth. And ultimately, I do think that that's another complimentary statement by our author. So again, reaffirming our sense that, again, there's some flowery language. There's this subject matter. The Victorian era is not really everybody's cup of tea, but at least we get that. They're not criticizing Cameron, at least from what I can tell. Skipping to the last sentence. This last sentence seems like a very direct answer to the question. So what is the effect of camera realism on theatrical scenes? I feel like if you ask that question, you'd get this last sentence as an answer from our author. In terms of mapping this thing out, the stuff that I skipped, again, probably more examples of what shows up in FSPs, and examples of non-photograph art that are not affected by realism, unlike the last sentence, which tells us that photograph art is affected by realism. Where this is going, I'm still not sure, but if I had to guess, probably expanding the discussion about the truth and realism that our author sees in FSPs. Again, I don't really have a very clear idea of where and why the author is going to go in a certain direction, but if you force me to guess, this is what I'd say. And so finally bringing us to paragraph 3 here. The reading phase. First sentence. Okay, so my forced guess from the last paragraph seems way off. The author seems to be discussing what looks to me like an entirely different aspect of FSPs, namely their singular combination of amateurism and artistry, which in turn is what our author thinks makes Cameron's FSPs a special quality, or gives them a special quality, excuse me. And again, that special, whatever that special quality is defined for us. I'm not going to bore you by typing out the whole thing here. I also probably don't have room for it. Skipping to the last sentence, although FSPs have been compared to shoddy plays, our author thinks the passing of Arthur, and I'm almost 100% sure that the passing of Arthur is in fact an FSP, but again, not completely sure, but almost completely sure. Our author thinks it's less like in the region of amateur garbage and more like a guilty pleasure, is what they're saying. So there's a distinction here. So finally, mapping for paragraph 3, what I skipped, probably we're going to get some details about the passing of Arthur, and a discussion of why it's not, in fact, just garbage, but instead is elevated to guilty pleasure status. Where this is going, nowhere. We're finally done with the passage, so I don't have to deal with that. Now, as I've been taking to doing recently, I'll just do an overview of my entire map so you get it all on one slide here. Paragraph 1 starts off with the idea that Cameron's FSPs are unintentionally funny. And it ends with the idea that FSPs are not successful executions of Cameron's seamless works of illustrative art goal, and they are not curiosities of Victorian photography like Rhinelander's stuff was. Paragraph 2. Camera realism is what gives FSPs an atmosphere of truth. This realism is kind of immersion breaking. A photo of actors acting out a scene is exactly that. It's not something that you can get lost in. And again, I feel like this was a succinct answer to a hypothetical question. If we were to ask the author, okay, so you told us that realism is a thing. What does it actually do? Why does it matter? I think this final sentence of paragraph 2 is our author's answer to that is that the realism forces us to see both the character being played and the real person trying to play that character. And finally, that brings us to paragraph 3. FSPs are special because they combine amateurism and artistry. At least one FSP, again I'm guessing here, but I'd be shocked if this wasn't an FSP. The passing of Arthur isn't pure garbage, but has some redeeming qualities that promote it to guilty pleasure status. Alright, so now that we've done the mapping bit, let's forge boldly into the questions here. Starting with number 8, which is a good old main point question, as we are used to seeing at the lead of questions. So my guess is, actually I'm somewhat lost. My best guess is to keep in mind the running theme of FSPs being unintentionally funny, but still special and, appreciated on some level, as opposed to being pure failure garbage that is not to be appreciated. Our author appreciates them. So let's assess our choices here. So starting with A, eliminating this one. This focuses entirely on the unintentionally funny aspect of FSPs, which again is factually in line with what I'm looking for. But there is no acknowledgement of why FSPs are nonetheless special. So because it doesn't have that sort of redeeming aspect to it, I am uncomfortable with it and I'm going to eliminate it. Starting strong out the gate here. Moving on to B, also getting rid of this one. I don't like the specificity of the whole simultaneous awareness thing. I could be wrong, it could be something that I skipped, but I won't revisit this unless I have to. As I was mapping this out, there was nothing that jumped out to me as the term simultaneous awareness. C, I'm going to eliminate this one as well. To me, it has the same problem as A, but just it's worse. It doesn't even call FSPs funny, so it's the same thing, just even farther off the mark. And D, also getting rid of this one. The whole idea of FSPs being funny is that we can obviously see that these people are often unwilling actors playing out a scene. This makes me rethink my stance on B a little bit. So rereading paragraph 4, since Arthur seems like a candidate for most successful FSP. There's clearly a dissonance between what the photo actually shows, which are these really mundane, recognizable, everyday objects as props, and the grand dramatic scene that it was meant to capture. And this is kind of interesting. That's why it made me rethink my stance on B's, because I do see a contrast, and so I'm still not 100% sold on simultaneous awareness being something to be, to identify as correct. I do at least see that paragraph 4 very strongly indicates that there are two things going at the same time, and so maybe I need to revisit B here. And E, which I probably normally would have eliminated, is now upgraded to a maybe because of my insight from D, that there are two separate things going on at the same time. So E is a maybe because, the whole subject versus scene idea, there is a sort of dichotomy between those two things. So again, like I've been saying, eliminating D, that process of rereading and checking what the deal was with the passage of Arthur, that made me upgrade both B and E to maybes that I need to revisit. So comparing the two, looking back at B, I think it actually works a lot better than I initially thought. A peculiar charm and circumstances are very much part of the discussion that our author is having. FSPs do have a peculiar charm, and they are funny precisely because the viewer notices the contrast between the grand drama Cameron tries to portray versus the hilarious reality of angry babies not being a very good infant Jesus model. And this is all from paragraph 2. So there is a contrast there, and maybe this actually relates to realism later on. I feel like maybe that's a connection that I failed to make as I was mapping this out, but maybe that comes from the realism that forces us to see both the character and the actor behind the character. But I'll make that connection when I have to later on. But right now, at least B lines up a lot better than I thought. Now E, compared to that, has a very detached tone. It doesn't necessarily exclude the possibility that the story being told about the subjects has charm due to the circumstances, but the language of it is nonetheless one step removed from the seemingly accurate discussion that B is having. So again, B is using all the right catchwords for me: peculiar charm, circumstances, and we do know that that's exactly where the peculiar charm comes from, where they're funny because we notice that contrast between the grandiose vision that Cameron is trying to come up with versus what the actual reality of what she's working with is putting forward. Unhappy models and unprofessional models, amateurs basically. And so E has a lot of the same elements of B, but it just removes itself from the discussion. So if I have these two left, I'm actually just going to pick B. So yeah, I would select B. I do want to note here that my initial willingness to eliminate, which included the correct answer in this case, must be paired with a willingness to revisit. And so this is something that I am especially careful of on leading questions like this one, especially for passages that I didn't really connect with, like I didn't really connect with this one. Um, if I didn't really connect with it, chances are the main point is going to be a little bit of a minefield. So while, for efficiency's sake, I personally start out the gate strong with strong eliminations, in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, I am still also going to look for reasons to revisit this if I have to. But that's just the theoretical sort of place that I put myself in. However, if confident eliminations bias you too heavily against reconsideration when you need it, then don't do what I just did here. Then just stick with your maybes and your question marks and the not X's, whatever notation that you have for not totally eliminating something. Just keep doing that. This whole strength of elimination thing for me only works because I have a particular way of doing things. You might want to try it if it helps, but I somehow doubt that it really is very widely applicable. I do feel like my dual nature of being very confident in the choices that I make, yet being on a dime, basically, at the drop of a pin, being able to just be like, okay, maybe maybe I missed something, maybe I need to rethink this. I don't think that that's something that's very widespread. So, yeah, take that as it is. Let's continue moving into the passage here. So, number 9, details about the props in the passing of Arthur. So, while I skipped over this block of detail in my initial reading, I did revisit paragraph 3 for answer choice D in question 8, as we just discussed here. So, in that rereading, I found that the author thinks the charm of Arthur comes from the clear contrast between the obviously not realistic props, like the broomsticks and the muslin, window dressings that she used, and the magical tone that the overall whole piece of work nonetheless manages to pull off. That's what I got out of paragraph 3. Putting that back into the language of paragraph 3's first sentence, it would seem that the props are the amateurism part. They're clearly, they're not fooling anybody, right? They're just things that non-professionals just cobble together. And the magic is the artistry part. So again, in my rereading, what I got out of paragraph 3 was the passing of Arthur has 2 elements to it. There's the obvious, unrealisticness of the props that are clearly identifiable as everyday objects and not like anything super special. But despite the obvious, unfittingness of the props, the overall work ended up taking on a magical tone, according to our author. And so, if I had to match up those 2 elements with the language of the first sentence of paragraph 3, this is where I'd fit them in. Props is attached to amateurism, magic is attached to artistry. So now to take that into the answers. A sounds pretty good, so I'm going to select it right off the bat. This is exactly how I saw the props in Arthur. They represented the amateurism of that particular work. Moving on to the next one, B, we're eliminating. This is what the magic and mystery part would be, not the props. C, also going to eliminate this one. The overtly obvious fakeness of the props wasn't presented as ingenuity. That really wasn't what they were saying here. It was put in contrast to the magic, but it wasn't being said that was genius, right? Moving on to D, I'm going to eliminate this one as well. Very much like C, the obvious fakeness of the props wasn't presented as intentional irony. In fact, we don't really know why Cameron did what she did with those props or chose those particular props. We're just told that they're in there, right? So yeah, there's no suggested reason why they're there. And E, we're also going to get rid of. And unlike C and D, this one is actually just patently false. The author gives quite a positive appraisal of Arthur, and the obvious fakeness of the props is part of that positive appraisal. Somehow, the contrast between the fakeness and the magic is kind of what makes Arthur so good. At least that's the sense that I got from paragraph 3. So yeah, this one, it's nice when things work out like this. Number 10. This one is kind of like an LR question that's snuck into RC. It's a strengthener. Which one of the following helps the claim about suspension of disbelief that we see in lines 34 through 36? So since I probably skipped lines 34 through 36 and looking at it, yes I did because not in the first lessons, gonna have to go reread it. And upon doing so, I see that this is more about the whole realism idea that I did catch in paragraph 2. The author claims here that we can suspend our disbelief about a narrative painting, but we can't do the same for narrative photos. Lines 36 and onward further elaborate why there's that difference. Apparently, the reason why we can do it for paintings but we can't do it for photos is that when we see a real person acting out character X in a photo, we can distinguish character X from the real person who is merely trying to act as character X, so that we were capable of doing that. And so yeah, that's as far as I'm going to get in terms of analysis. So let's see what answer choices kind of line up with um, that mechanism that I identified. So A, I'm going to eliminate. How long it takes to sit for painting versus photo, I don't think that was really part of the elaboration that we got in lines 36 and beyond in terms of the character X versus the person playing character X. That whole thing didn't really touch on how long it takes to sit for a painting. B, I'm also going to get rid of. This isn't directly about the character versus real person acting as the character distinction that I've just been talking about. However, I'm willing to revisit this if I'm forced to. B's discussion of impossible situations at least potentially links to the not real character versus quite real person thing that I am looking for. So I could see being forced to accept that connection, but I don't want to make it unless I'm forced to. Moving on to C, also an elimination. To me, it's just as irrelevant as A. Again, I'm looking for the distinction between the character and the person playing the character. That's what makes suspension of disbelief more or less impossible in photos. And so yeah, to me, C brings up something just as irrelevant as A. Moving along to D. In many respects, this is like B, but this time there's a direct mention of the real person, the sitter, versus the character they're playing, an imaginary persona. So that to me makes D superior. And this should be somewhat familiar to you. This is the exact same discussion that I had about choices B versus E in our very first question, question 8. They structurally were saying the same thing in a sense that D and B are kind of saying similar things here, but just like B here is a step removed, E from question 8 was also a step removed. It was just a little bit too theoretical. Whereas B from question 8 and D from this question are right on the money. They're using the exact terms that I was looking for. So I would choose the one that gives me the terms that I'm looking for and has the right structure versus the second best answer that has none of the terms I'm looking for but has a possibly correct structure. And that brings us to E, which I will also eliminate. To me, again, it's just as irrelevant as A and C. These artist school period factors bear no relation to the character versus person playing that character distinction that I've been harping on about for this entire slide. So now moving on to 11, which is an inference question. This one is asking us about what is Cameron's relationship to her FSPs. So just a note here, even if you weren't able to translate this question stem up front in the way that I just did here, a quick glance over the answer choices should make it pretty clear what the question is driving at. They're all talking about the relationship of an artist to their art. And based on paragraph 1's ending, I see that our author tells us that Cameron intended her FSPs as seamless works of illustrative art, whatever that is, but failed to do so. But the story doesn't end there. Our author doesn't write off FSPs as mere failures, but goes on to talk about their value and charm that arguably stem from that very failure. But that's all still pretty general. If this question wants us to get more specific, and I would say it's at least 50-50 that inference questions do want us to get more specific than that. I guess if I had to push it, I'd say that Cameron took ordinary people and things and tried to get them to act out scenes that are far more grandiose. The results were unintentionally hilarious because of all the things that we talked about. She was trying to do seamless works of illustrative art, some grand vision. What she got was, angry babies and impatient adults and, amateurishly obvious props. So what she tried to do and what she tried to do it with were quite at odds there. So A, gonna get rid of this one. Nothing in my passage map and rereading suggests that Cameron was aiming to create distance between her characters and audience. And not only do we not know that Cameron was trying to do that, I don't think that FSPs do create that distance at all. If anything, our author seems to be talking about how relatable it is, in a sense, so I feel like this is really barking up the wrong tree. Moving on to the next one, also eliminating this. Nothing in my passage map and rereadings suggests that Cameron was trying to subvert anything. Whether or not she managed to do so unintentionally by making nominally serious scenes turn out funny due to the whole amateurism thing, that's a different discussion. But again, there was, as we've had occasion to talk about previously, our author simply tells us that a lot of things just happen. They don't really attempt to suggest why they happened or what Cameron was thinking when she ended up doing those things. So yeah, B gives an intentionality to Cameron that we just simply do not have. This one I actually like. C I like. This is exactly what ordinary people and things put into grandiose scenes. From my prediction, my more specific prediction, this is exactly what it is. Cameron, specifically, her work involved taking ordinary stuff and putting it into these scenes, and then we also hear that the result of doing so was unintentional hilarious. Moving along to D&E for academic purposes, I'm going to eliminate this one as well. There is no meaningful discussion of practicality in Cameron's FSP design. Again, it's pretty much the same problem as answer choice B. We don't know anything about her design or her intents beyond the very few things that her goal was to create seamless works of illustrative art, but we don't really know anything beyond that. We don't need anything more specific than that. So practicality is well beyond the information that we have about Cameron's intentions. E. I'm going to eliminate this one as well. This starts off alarmingly strong, enough to make me second guess myself, like, is C really correct? The ordinary people being employed as actors, because that's exactly what I was looking for, right? But it ends up in documentary territory, which I think is entirely counter to the fantastical scenes that FSP depicted, especially when it comes to stuff like the passing of Arthur. It's just out of line with what we know about Cameron's work. So moving into number 12 now. This is an author agreement question, except, so we have to pick the one that our author wouldn't agree with, and we're eliminating everyone that the author would agree with here. So let's start right up with here. So again, I'm not going to list predictions. I'm just going to check each response against what we've already discussed and reread if necessary. So starting with the beginning here. This one is another elimination. The author agreed with this very same thing. Paintings do allow for suspension of disbelief. Photos don't. In question 10, we already had the discussion, so our author agreed with it. I'm not going to spend any more time on it. Next one, another elimination. Paragraph 3 is all about how the visible amateurishness in the FSP works contributes to their peculiar charm, whatever that might be. This is, and the next one is also another elimination. This is very much what we've been talking about in paragraphs 2 and 3. The amateur shabbiness of FSPs contribute to their value. This one is another elimination. Our ability to see both the character and the person playing the character is exactly what was discussed in paragraph 2, question 10, and to add on top of that, choice A here. We've hit this at least 3 times, and so there's no point in harping on it any further. Which brings us to E, and not only by process of elimination, but also it sounds pretty good. As we saw at the end of paragraph 1, our author's perspective is that Cameron failed to achieve this intended objective with the FSP. But as we discussed for question 11, just on the previous slide, the author at the same time doesn't think that's the end of the story. There's more to FSPs other than the fact that Cameron failed to achieve that objective with them. And more specifically, the special charm of FSP stems from those very same failures, though those awkward situations that are obviously captured by the FSPs. And so E suggests that Cameron's failure to achieve her intended objectives with FSPs means FSPs failed as a whole, and I would say that our author very much disagrees with that idea. And so 13 is another inference. This one is about Cameron's era, which is the Victorian era. And again, in case you missed it, not only is Rylander, who we're told is another Victorian artist and contemporary of Cameron, the little 2-line introduction that is above the passage proper, that also identifies Cameron as a Victorian era person. So due to massive skipping, I'm going to have to go answer by answer on this one. Admittedly, this is not ideal, but it works for me here given the raw time savings for me that come from such skipping. Chances are the rest of you will be much better equipped than I am to make rapid judgments here, so this is one thing where, again, grain of salt. This is just the way I do things. I am not going to pretend like it's the way that you should always be doing things. So starting right with A, as we always do, this one's another elimination. If anything, there was at least some interest, since she had contemporaries, Rylander and other Victorian photographers. And then, again, remember that the 2-line pre-passage intro calls Cameron specifically that. Another elimination down the line with B, scanning paragraph 1 for this, I'm coming up with nothing. We've reread paragraph 2, a couple times now, but gonna scan it again. Also coming up with nothing. Same for paragraph 3. I don't see any mention of the demographics behind photography at the time. Similar situation for C. Another elimination. I didn't see anything of the sort that I did in my near complete scan of the passage for answer choice B. D, I'm also going to eliminate. Didn't see anything of the sort in my scan for B. And that leaves us again with E by process of elimination, but also it's not bad. Paragraph 2 mentions that sitting still for an FSP was an ordeal. I'm not entirely sure that the difficulty has to do with how long it took to sit for a photo or if it came from playing along with Cameron's weird designs. So honestly, I'd have a hard time picking this if it weren't for my confidence in eliminating the rest. But there is at least some mention of, taking these photos not being a fun, easy thing to do. Again, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that the difficulty of the taking of the photo has anything to do with how long it took to sit for it, because I don't think we get any factual confirmation of that. But it's at least not quite as far off as the 4 that we've just eliminated. So now that brings us to 14. What is the purpose of discussing suspension of disbelief? And again, this is a concept that we've come right, head to head with already. But let's bring it home here. I'm really not exactly sure how to frame the purpose of that discussion. I think I understand what it is, but I don't really know why it's there. I really can't say. I personally, when I read it, I thought it was just another thing that the author decided to discuss about FSPs. That's how I saw it. If I had to give it a specific purpose within the passage, I do see that I could fit it inside a progression. It's not something that I would naturally do, but if forced to, I think I could see this. Paintings, we're told, allow for suspension. Photos do not. Photos don't allow for suspension because viewers can see both the imaginary character and the real person attempting to portray that imaginary character. The incredibly obvious contrast between the real and the imaginary, a la, Arthur and his painfully obvious use of recognizably mundane objects as props, that's what gives FSPs their special charm. So that's the structure that I see. Again, I'm not really sure if that really leads up to a purpose or really tells us why in a nutshell, but that's where I'm going to start. So A is going to be an elimination. Our author wants to talk about FSPs, not make a passage-long comment on suspension of disbelief. So A kind of elevates suspension of disbelief to the whole point of it, and that's clearly not how I see the passage. B, I'm going to pick because it sounds pretty good. It lines up nicely with what our author wants to say about contrast in FSPs between the real and the imaginary. So C, moving on to C, I'm going to eliminate this one. Our author never embarked on an overall attack against narrative photography. So this just doesn't seem right. D, also going to get rid of. Our author never really got into FSPs and Cameron haters, much less devoting any effort to debunking the haters. And finally, I'm also going to get rid of E. The whole suspension of disbelief discussion achieved the exact opposite of this, if anything. FSPs are really not at all like narrative paintings, since FSPs don't allow for suspension of disbelief. So yeah, that's why I don't really like this one at all. So we are now on the final one, number 15, and this one is a main purpose question. This is very much an opportunity to have the exam itself demonstrate what it means by content versus structure. So main point questions like number 8 and like the ones we see at the beginning of pretty much every other passage, those are properly answered by more content-centric answers. What did the author really say? These answers will be very noun-driven. They will include facts and terms and specific things from the passage itself. Main purpose questions like number 15 are more properly answered by more structure-driven responses. How or why did the author say what they said? These answers will be very verb-driven, as you'll see shortly when we review answer choices. So before we actually do the analysis, again, I want to reiterate, compare the correct answer for this question against the correct answer for question number 8 to get a distinction of what the exam means by structure versus content. So question 8 is going to demonstrate content. This question here is going to demonstrate structure. So starting right up with A, this is an elimination. I got 0 sense, absolutely none, that we were following Cameron's progress in this field. Yes, there was high praise for Arthur, so maybe she started low and ended up high, but really as written, the passage doesn't even tell us if Arthur was an early or late work of hers. There's no sense of Cameron's on a journey from point A to point B and we're following her along. None of that. So we're getting rid of it. B, I'm going to select because I like it. Now, this is exactly what we've encountered time and time again. So what this says is that, Cameron failed to achieve her grandiose goals with FSPs from paragraph 1 due to, photographs having realism, which is discussed in paragraph 2, which in turn forces viewers to notice that the contrast between real people and props used and the imaginary scenes which those real people and props were intended to portray. So again, that whole inability for us to not be able to see, or maybe I'll stop with the double negative, our forced ability to be able to distinguish the character being portrayed from the actor portraying them. Our inability to separate or to not do both of those things at the same time, that's what gives that's the result of realism, and that again is in paragraph 2. But that very contrast in paragraph 3 is presented as what works about FSPs, albeit in a way that maybe Cameron didn't intend because Cameron was going for something else. But yeah, as far as we can tell, that's the structure that we've seen, and that's kind of what B says right here. The tension between Cameron's aims and the results she achieved in some of her works enhances the work's aesthetic value. I feel like this is basically telling us, in a nutshell, uh, what our author would say about the passing of Arthur. And yes, the passing of Arthur is ultimately the end. But looking back on it, I guess the author was kind of building all the way to this, where they start by telling us, what her work actually is, tells us that it's FSPs, tells us what FSPs are, tells us that FSPs actually failed their creator's purpose, but they're still charming. We're assured that by the author repeatedly that they're still kind of cool and I guess cute to look at. And paragraph 2 introduces this whole suspension of disbelief and photorealism. Or I don't know if photorealism is the right term because that's a specific terminology from art. Photographic realism is what I'll say. That the inescapable realism in these photographs is kind of what gives rise to the contrast. And we're further told in paragraph 3 that there's another work that has this exact contrast. We see that she's using broomsticks and curtains as props, clearly identifiable everyday objects. But at the same time, it manages to create a somehow magically mystical scene. And so that whole contrast works according to our author, and I can see the progression here in B. C, I'm going to eliminate. I don't even. What is it? Oeuvre? I guess pardon my French. It's similar to Louvre, but not even spelled the same way. But ignoring that word for a moment, the English language portion, the rest of the answer is just wrong. It is not Cameron's theatrical vision that accounts for both the strengths and weaknesses of FSPs. Rather, that role goes to photo's inability to permit suspension of disbelief, leading the viewer to always notice that dissonance between the real and the imaginary in FSPs. We can't really get lost in the picture. We see that we have a grumpy baby who is trying to be Jesus, clearly is not baby Jesus, that sort of thing. So yeah, even if we don't really, and I still to this day, even though I've done this passage probably, it's in the 70s, so I probably haven't done it quite as much as some of the ones in different zones of the exam's life, but I've done this one multiple times, probably at least 5 or 6 times. Still don't know what that word is, still don't feel the need to know what that word is. Moving on to D, eliminate. There was no discussion of Cameron setting out to achieve prestige like D is suggesting, much less that such a project was doomed to fail. Don't be seduced by a passing mention of the great masterpieces of Western painting that came up in paragraph 1. There is zero indication that Cameron was looking to get on a similar level of prestige. She might have wanted to depict the same scenes, but we're not told anything further than that. Again, this passage is kind of light on discussing what Cameron's intentions really were when she chose to do certain things. So we don't really know why she embarked on FSPs other than the fact that was just her project, that she wanted to make seamless works of illustrative art. But first of all, I don't even know exactly what that particular term means, seamless work of illustrative art. All I know is that Cameron failed to do so. But there's nothing in that term or around that term that tells me that she was doing this FSP project in order to get on the same level of sort of acclaim and prestige as these other works. So yeah, don't let paragraph 1 lead you astray. And finally, that brings us to E. I'm going to eliminate this one as well. Like we discussed on the previous question, there's no mention of detractors. The author doesn't really talk about Cameron haters, and so yeah, it's just not in there. So yeah. And that brings us to the takeaway portion here. As always, I am pretty open, at least I would like to believe that I am, when I don't really know where the author is going with the passage. I do believe that's properly reflected in my recorded progress here, on the very first question, number 8, as well as through the questions, the whole set of questions as a whole from 8 through 15. I started with a relatively low resolution idea. It was a blurry picture, to be honest. Cameron failed to achieve some illustrative art goal. Again, I still don't know what that is. With FSPs. But that's actually a good thing according to the author. And I continued to refine this low resolution picture, question after question, to what it ended up being, which is too big to recreate here, but the whole progression that I talked about in terms of we start the discussion here and then we talk about suspension of disbelief, and that leads to why, Passing of Arthur is as good as it is. It turned into that over the course of these 7 or 8 questions. I want to stress that I don't really take an effort separately to achieve this refinement. This happens naturally as I assess answer choices and selectively reread the passage within the context of questions and answer choices. So this is me. This is what I mean when I say that I let the exam do some of the work for me. I am not trying to do this out of whole cloth with no idea blindly. The language of the questions and answer choices are directing how I'm looking at things, as well as taking cues from my structural map as well. So those things are all directing my efforts when I am forced to go back and look at details. I am very well equipped to do so. I'm not just looking for the thing and then starting from scratch once I find the thing. I already know, based on what the questions are telling me, what the answer choices are telling me, and what my map tells me, why I'm looking for that detail. It really. Or at least I'm given a lens through which to look at it. So this is really the point here. I, and you by extension, do not need to have a super strong iron grasp of exactly everything right away. Pursue the strongest grasp possible when it suits you, but don't panic reread on your initial read through if that iron grip isn't happening. So an initial structure focused read through, even when the overall structure isn't immediately apparent, will help you research the passage, and that research will in turn help you build a better idea of what's actually going on. When you do find the relevant detail, you'll have a pretty decent idea of how you're supposed to think about it, who it helps, why it helps. That was the whole lens thing I'm talking about. So again, the helpful lens that structural reading gives you is that when you do have to go back and deal with the detail, the content, the specific things, not just the structure will nonetheless help you, when you find the detail, know how it is you're supposed to look at the detail, how you're supposed to interpret it. Just as importantly, you'll become more immune to potentially derailing details. Think about the thing that I just mentioned in the final question about the reference to masterpieces of Western painting from paragraph 1. Structurally, that point really has no place whatsoever in the other discussions this passage ends up moving through. Hence my ability to dismiss it as a passing mention and nothing more than that. So again, structure is what gives you that context to look at that detail. Like, okay, that's there, but it doesn't matter. How do I know it doesn't matter? Well, looking at the structure of the passage and everything else that the questions have told me about it, this isn't what matters. The rest of the discussion is not at all about painting. It's about what's special about photography versus painting. So the masterpiece of Western painting, they don't really play a role other than they're a type of work that Cameron didn't basically reach with her FSPs. All right, so that brings us to the end. Thanks for being here. Leave a comment. As I mentioned earlier, I did this passage as a demonstration specifically because someone specifically requested it in a comment. So I read them. I may not be able to respond in a timely manner, but I do read them. So feel free to leave a comment, or more often as you guys feel more comfortable doing, as it appears, email me directly at this email address here. Also, if you have any tutoring inquiries, everything should go to that email as well. All right, so thanks for sitting through it, and I will see you in the next one.